There are stories from history that we must tell, not because they're easy to hear, but because forgetting them would be a betrayal of those who suffered. What I'm about to share with you are the documented accounts of women and girls who stood against one of history's darkest forces and paid the ultimate price for their courage. This isn't speculation. This isn't dramatization. Every detail you're about to hear comes from historical records, witness testimonies, and the photographs that survived the war. These are stories of real people, daughters, sisters, mothers, who made the choice to resist, knowing full well what awaited them if they were caught. By the time Nazi forces swept through Belarus in 1941, the world had already seen glimpses of what occupation would mean. But nothing could have prepared the people of the Soviet Union for the systematic brutality that would follow. And while we often think of resistance fighters as men with guns in the forest, the reality was far more complex. Women and girls, some barely teenagers, became the backbone of underground networks that saved lives, gathered intelligence, and struck back at an enemy that seemed unstoppable. What happened to them when they were caught is difficult to comprehend even now, decades later, but their stories must be told, not to sensationalize their suffering, but to honor their sacrifice and to remind ourselves what happens when hatred is allowed to flourish unchecked. Let me take you back to October 26, 1941, in the city of Minsk. October in Minsk is cold. The leaves have already fallen, and there's a bite in the air that hints at the brutal winter to come. On this particular Sunday morning, October 26, 1941, German occupation forces ordered the residents of Minsk to gather in several locations throughout the city. This wasn't optional. This was a command. 12 people were being marched through the streets. Around their necks hung crude signs that read, "We are partisans who fired on German troops." Among them were two young women. The first was Olga Shcherbatsevich. The second woman's identity wouldn't be confirmed until after the war ended. It took investigators years to establish that she was 17-year-old Masha Bruskina. 17 years old. Think about that for a moment. Masha had been working with an underground group operating out of a hospital. Their mission was straightforward but incredibly dangerous. They were smuggling wounded Red Army soldiers out of the hospital, providing them with fake documents and civilian clothes, and helping them reach partisan detachments in the forests. According to historical records, at least 40 people were saved through this network. The irony, and it's a bitter one, is that Masha was ultimately betrayed by one of the very people she had saved. A wounded Red Army commander she had helped escape turned informant. In 1951, 6 years after the war ended, he was found and executed for his betrayal. But that was cold comfort. The damage had been done years earlier. When the Germans came for the underground network, they arrested Olga Shcherbatsevich along with her young son. During the interrogation that followed, Olga was beaten so severely that she couldn't walk back to her cell unassisted. The other members of the group suffered similar treatment. The Nazis weren't just looking for information, they were making an example, and they were meticulous about it. A German photographer was assigned to document the entire execution process, every step, every moment. The goal was propaganda, to show the consequences of resistance. But here's where something remarkable happened. A local photographer, a Belarusian resident whose name has been lost to history, managed to obtain the negatives. At tremendous personal risk, he made copies and hid them until the city was liberated. It's because of those photographs that we know exactly what happened that day. The 12 condemned prisoners were divided into 4 groups. They were taken to different locations throughout the city: the Drama Theater, Karl Marx Street, Freedom Square, and the gates of the yeast factory. This wasn't random. The Germans wanted as many people as possible to witness what happened to those who resisted. The photographs show something that the Nazis hadn't planned on capturing. They show defiance. Masha Bruskina, her face already bearing the marks of torture, refused to face the crowd. The executioners tried to force her to turn around. They wanted the assembled residents to see her face, to see the fear they assumed would be there, but Masha kept her back turned. even at the gallows, even after everything they had done to her, she would not give them that satisfaction. They hanged her anyway, her back still turned to the crowd. She was 17 years old. She had saved 40 lives, and the Nazis murdered her in public to terrorize a city into submission. But here's what they didn't understand. Terror can only work if it breaks the spirit of the terrorized, and the people of Belarus were not broken. About 80 miles to the east of Minsk lies the city of Orsha. When German forces occupied it in 1941, they expected the same pattern they'd seen elsewhere: initial resistance followed by grudging compliance. What they got instead was a 16-year-old girl named Olga Domesh, who refused to accept occupation. Olga was just 16 when she created an underground youth group. Their activities started simply: distributing leaflets, collecting information about German troop movements, small acts of defiance that might seem insignificant but that kept hope alive. As the occupation continued, Olga's activities escalated. She eventually left the city entirely and joined a partisan detachment operating in the forests. And she was good at it. Remarkably good. The Germans put a bounty on her head: 10,000 Reichsmarks, plus land and livestock for anyone who could capture or kill her. For perspective, that was an enormous sum, equivalent to years of wages for most people. The fact that they were offering that much tells you how seriously they took the threat she represented. Olga had a younger sister named Lydia. While Olga fought with the partisans in the forest, Lydia became a scout for the same detachment. Her code name was Chick, a reference to her youth and her ability to move through occupied territory without arousing suspicion. Lydia was perfect for intelligence work. She looked young and innocent, exactly the kind of person German soldiers would overlook, and she used that to devastating effect. One of her most successful operations involved sabotaging a fuel depot. The resulting explosion and fire paralyzed railway traffic for 4 hours, a significant disruption that affected German supply lines and troop movements. For a partisan detachment with limited resources, that kind of impact was extraordinary. But intelligence work is dangerous, and the margin for error is non-existent. In 1943, Lydia was given what should have been a simple assignment: deliver a note to the mother of another partisan. It was a message to let the woman know her son was alive and safe. A small thing, really, meant to provide comfort to a worried mother. Lydia was stopped by a German patrol. They searched her and found the note. There was no way to explain it away, no cover story that would work. The note mentioned her sister Olga by name, referring to her as someone who had been in the partisan detachment for a full year. It was documented in the official interrogation protocol. We have that document. It survived the war. They arrested Lydia immediately. When they came for her mother, the woman managed to escape and fled to the partisan detachment, leaving everything behind. What happened to Lydia during her interrogation is documented in witness testimonies given after the liberation. Her face was burned with cigarettes, not once, but repeatedly, methodically. Then her spine was broken. Once she was completely immobilized, unable to move or defend herself, they shot her. She never revealed any information about the partisan network, not a single name, not a single location. Her sister Olga survived the war. Imagine living with that, knowing that your younger sister died protecting you and your comrades, knowing the torture she endured, knowing she never broke. Some stories sound too incredible to be true. This is one of them. And yet, every detail has been verified by Soviet investigators and documented in official records. In 1941, Nadia Bogdanova, B.A., was 9 years old. 9. She was living in an orphanage in the Vitebsk region when the Germans invaded. By all rights, she should have been evacuated, should have been kept far from the fighting. Instead, she became one of the youngest documented members of the partisan resistance, and one of the most remarkable. Nadia served as a liaison for a partisan detachment, carrying messages and supplies between different units. It was dangerous work for anyone, let alone a child. And in late 1941, during a German sweep operation, she was caught. She was taken outside the city along with dozens of other detained civilians and partisans. They were lined up to be shot. The Germans opened fire. Nadia fell, but she fell a fraction of a second before the bullet reached her. Whether it was instinct or incredible luck, she dropped to the ground just in time. The bullet missed, and as the bodies of the dead and dying collapsed around her, Nadia stayed perfectly still. She waited until nightfall. Then, moving carefully to avoid making any sound, she crawled out from under the bodies of the people who had been murdered beside her. She was 9 years old, and she had just survived a mass execution through quick thinking and sheer will to live. Most people would have run as far from the partisans as possible after an experience like that. Most people would have tried to disappear, to survive the war quietly. Nadia went back to the partisan detachment, and she didn't just go back, she fought. She fought with a fury born of having watched her friends murdered. Historical records indicate that she successfully carried out several sabotage operations, including single-handedly derailing a German military train. A 9-year-old girl derailed a military train. In February 1943, more than a year after her first brush with death, Nadia received orders to blow up a bridge near the village of Karakul. She successfully mined the bridge, but was detained by a German patrol before she could get clear. They searched her basket and found traces of explosives. At first, the Germans weren't sure what they had. A girl this young carrying explosives? It seemed unlikely. But then the bridge exploded. It collapsed into the river in a shower of wood and stone and twisted metal, and suddenly it became very clear that they had captured a partisan. What followed was systematic torture designed to break a child and extract information about the partisan network. They burned a star into her back, not quickly, but slowly, making sure she felt every second of it. They threw her onto a red-hot stove. They poured ice water over her in freezing temperatures. They did everything they could to make her talk. Nadia said nothing, not a word, not a name, not a location. Finally, having failed to break her, they threw her out into the snow outside the village and left her to die of exposure. It was February in Belarus, temperatures well below freezing. For a child who had been tortured and was likely in shock, death should have come quickly, but Nadia survived. Local villagers found her and hid her until partisan forces could evacuate her to safety. The torture had damaged her sight and hearing so severely that she spent years after the war undergoing medical treatment. Soviet doctors gradually managed to restore both, though never completely. Nadia Bogdanova became the only documented Soviet pioneer, the Soviet youth organization, to survive 2 separate execution attempts. She lived to see the Soviet Union collapse and the independence of Belarus. She lived long enough to tell her story, to testify about what she had witnessed and endured. Think about the strength that required. Think about what it means that a 9-year-old girl survived 2 executions and never, ever betrayed her comrades. Not every story comes with names attached. Not every act of resistance was documented with the precision we might hope for. And sometimes the lack of documentation tells its own story about how the Nazis operated and how little they cared about recording the identities of those they murdered. On November 3, 1941, in the village of Borisuol in the Dua region, German forces hanged 5 people on suspicion of being partisans. The execution took place on the 2nd day after the village was occupied. The 2nd day. There hadn't been time for any kind of investigation, any gathering of evidence, any semblance of legal process, however corrupted that process might have been under occupation. Among the 5 executed, 2 were men. The other 3 were women. We have names for some of them, recovered from witness testimonies gathered after liberation: Mitrofanovna, Praskovia, and Afilona. A woman identified only as Merkulova was also hanged, but her first name was never recorded. These weren't combatants caught in the act. These were villagers, pulled from their homes and hanged based on nothing more than suspicion or denunciation. And the Germans made a spectacle of it. After the women were hanged, for reasons that make no sense by any standard of human decency, the executioners removed Merkulova's body from the gallows. They placed her on her knees in front of the other bodies, the other executed people who still hung from the ropes. They staged it, arranged it like some kind of grotesque tableau. Why? What possible purpose could that serve? The answer is that it served no purpose except to dehumanize, to degrade, to send a message that, under occupation, human life had no value and human dignity had no meaning. We don't know much about these women. We don't know if they were actually involved in resistance activities or if they were simply victims of denunciation, killed because of a grudge, or because they had something someone else wanted, or because they happened to be in the wrong place when the Germans wanted to make an example. What we do know is that their execution took place so quickly after occupation that there's no way proper evidence could have been gathered. We know that making examples of women was part of the terror strategy, and we know that their names, or what we have of their names, survived because someone cared enough to remember them and to testify after liberation. In the chaos and brutality of occupation, that act of remembering was itself a form of resistance. Mogilev, a city in eastern Belarus, developed one of the most remarkable underground networks of the entire occupation, and it operated right under the Germans' noses, inside a hospital. After occupation, a group of doctors and medical workers made a decision. They would use their positions to actively resist. They began secretly diverting medical supplies, bandages, medicines, surgical instruments, to partisan detachments in the forests. They even managed to steal blood from the hospital where wounded German soldiers were being treated and smuggled it out to treat wounded partisans. But the most dangerous work was the evacuation of wounded Red Army soldiers. When the front collapsed and German forces swept through the region, thousands of Soviet soldiers were left behind, wounded, separated from their units, hiding wherever they could. Many ended up in hospitals, where they faced either execution or deportation to concentration camps if discovered. The Mogilev Medical Underground began secretly moving these men out of the hospital. They provided false documents identifying them as civilians. They arranged safe houses and transport to partisan-controlled territory. It was an incredibly complex operation requiring coordination, courage, and absolute secrecy. Then someone betrayed them. In the first wave of arrests, 3 members of the group were seized. Among them was Dr. Alexandra Bruskina. On what the Germans called Glory Square, the Soviets had called it Soviet Square, all 3 were publicly hanged. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who help the enemy. But the underground didn't stop. They reorganized. They continued their work. Doctors from the group even traveled to partisan camps to perform surgeries on wounded fighters. They operated under conditions that would be unthinkable in any normal medical setting. In forests, in caves, with limited supplies and no proper facilities. In May 1943, the Gestapo arrested another 5 members of the group. The torture that followed was described in testimonies as inhumane, a word that feels inadequate given what we know about Nazi interrogation methods. The Gestapo wanted names. They wanted to know who else was involved, which partisans had been helped, where the supply routes led. They got nothing. On June 24, 1943, all 5 were publicly hanged in the same square where their predecessors had died months earlier. Even after this second wave of executions, the underground continued to function. The network they had built was resilient enough that it survived the arrest and execution of multiple key members. Medical supplies continued to flow to the partisans. Wounded soldiers continued to be evacuated. It's worth stopping to consider what motivated these people. These were doctors, highly educated professionals who could potentially have kept their heads down, treated German patients, and survived the war. Instead, they chose to risk everything to save wounded enemy combatants and support partisan fighters. Dr. Alexandra Bruskina was hanged for being a doctor who took her Hippocratic oath seriously. Let that sink in. There are gradations of cruelty, even in war. There are things that strike us as particularly unconscionable, even when set against a backdrop of systematic atrocity. What happened to Anastasia Raduk and her children falls into that category. Anastasia was the deputy head of an underground group operating in Koladishi. Her husband, Arseny Raduk, was a commissar with a partisan detachment, a political officer, someone the Germans particularly wanted to capture or kill. In 1943, based on information from an informant, the Gestapo arrested Anastasia along with another resistance member, the wife of partisan leader Milokovic. Both women were tortured. We have testimony about that from multiple sources. The goal was to get them to reveal information about the partisan detachments, to give up the locations of camps, to identify other members of the underground. They revealed nothing. So the Germans tried a different approach. They decided to use Anastasia's children as leverage. They took her 3 daughters and her son, children ranging in age from young to very young, and brought them to a public square. They forced Anastasia and Milokovic to watch as they prepared to execute the children. The deal was simple. If Commissar Arseny Raduk surrendered himself, the children would be spared, and then they carried out the execution, not once, 4 times. Let me be clear about what I'm saying. They staged the execution of these children 4 separate times, making their mother watch each time, psychologically torturing her with the belief that she was about to witness her children's murder. What Anastasia experienced during those 4 mock executions is beyond any ability to adequately describe. The terror, the helplessness, the desperate hope each time that somehow they would be spared, the crushing realization each time that the nightmare was continuing. Historical records don't tell us whether Arseny Raduk knew what was happening. They don't tell us if the Germans made any genuine attempt to contact him with their ultimatum, or if this was simply torture for its own sake, punishment for Anastasia's refusal to cooperate. What we do know is that after the 4th execution, the Germans carried through with their threat. Both women, Anastasia Raduk and Milokovic, were publicly hanged. But here's where a remarkable thing happened. The partisan detachment, having learned what was happening, organized a rescue operation. They succeeded in saving Anastasia's children. All 4 survived the war. Think about what that means. Think about the level of coordination and courage required to mount a rescue operation for children in occupied territory, right under the Germans' noses. Think about the fact that partisans, people who barely had enough supplies to keep themselves alive, prioritized saving these children. The children survived. Their mother did not. But her last knowledge, we can hope, was that her children had a chance, that her husband and his comrades were coming for them. It's a small mercy in a story with very few of them. What I've shared with you so far are individual stories, specific women, specific acts of resistance, specific fates. But it's important to understand that these weren't isolated incidents. What happened to these women was part of a systematic approach to occupation and control. Soviet investigators, working after liberation, documented torture methods used throughout occupied Belarus. The documents make for difficult reading. They contain testimony from survivors, from witnesses, from people who saw the aftermath, and what they reveal is that the torture wasn't random or spontaneous, it was calculated and methodical. The goal was information, but it was also terror. When a partisan or underground fighter was captured, the interrogators would often arrest teenagers from the area, children who had nothing to do with resistance activities. They would bring these children into the interrogation room and torture them in front of the captured partisan until the partisan revealed names, locations, or other intelligence. Very few people could withstand watching innocent children being tortured because of them. For women specifically, the torture often involved sexual violence. Rape, usually carried out by local collaborators rather than German soldiers, was followed by mutilation. Historical records document women having their breasts cut off, their teeth torn out, their faces deliberately disfigured before execution. Medieval torture instruments were brought out of museums or recreated. Racks designed to dislocate joints, heated implements for burning, instruments for gouging and cutting. Ears were cut off. Eyes were removed. The torture was designed not just to extract information, but to destroy the person being tortured, to reduce them to something less than human. And, after the torture, the executions themselves were often prolonged. Women who no longer understood anything from the pain, who were barely conscious, who could no longer speak or process what was happening, were drowned in wells or reservoirs. They were burned alive, they were thrown into mine shafts and left to die slowly in the darkness. There are documented cases of partisans being so severely injured through torture that they couldn't walk to their own executions. German and collaborationist executioners had to carry them, literally carry them in their arms, to the place where they would be killed. Let that image settle in your mind for a moment. A person tortured so severely they can't walk, and their torturers carrying them, not to medical help, but to the gallows or the execution pit. This wasn't the heat of battle. This wasn't split-second decisions made under fire. This was deliberate, systematic, bureaucratic cruelty. You might be wondering why I'm telling you these stories. Why dredge up these particular horrors from a war that ended 80 years ago? There are thousands of stories of atrocity from World War II. Why these women specifically? Here's why. Because these stories are about choice. Every single woman I've talked about today made a choice. Masha Bruskina chose to help wounded soldiers even though she knew the risks. The Domesh sisters chose active resistance. Nadia Bogdanova, at 9 years old, chose to return to the Partisans after surviving an execution. The doctors of Mogilev chose to risk their lives and their careers to save others. Anastasia Raduk chose silence even as they staged her children's executions. These weren't women who had combat training. They weren't professional soldiers or spies. They were teenagers, teachers, doctors, mothers. They were ordinary people living in occupied territory who made the extraordinary choice to resist. And here's what's crucial to understand. The Germans were shocked by the scale of resistance they encountered in the Soviet Union. They had expected conquered populations to submit. They had seen it work in other occupied territories. They thought a combination of brutal force and public executions would terrify people into compliance. It didn't work. Every public execution was meant to deter 10 others from resisting. Instead, each execution created 10 more resistors. Every act of brutality strengthened rather than weakened the resolve to fight back. The Nazis fundamentally misunderstood that there's a point where terror becomes counterproductive, where people decide that submission is worse than death. These women understood something that their occupiers didn't. That some things are worth dying for, that human dignity cannot be destroyed by torture, that resistance, even when it costs everything, is meaningful. Now, I want to talk about why this is relevant today, in 2025. We live in a time when authoritarianism is rising in various parts of the world. When we see governments using systematic terror against their own populations. When we see rhetoric that dehumanizes entire groups of people based on ethnicity, religion, or political belief. When we see people arguing that resistance is futile, that ordinary people can't make a difference against powerful state machinery. These stories prove that's not true. Yes, many of these women died. Yes, the price of their resistance was terrible. But their resistance mattered. It saved lives. It disrupted German operations. It kept hope alive. And ultimately, the partisan movement they contributed to helped drive the occupiers out. The systematic documentation of these atrocities, the photographs, the testimonies, the official records, exists because people like that Belarusian photographer in Minsk risked their lives to preserve evidence. They understood that bearing witness is itself a form of resistance, that remembering is an act of defiance against those who would prefer their crimes be forgotten. There's a reason the Nazis tried to destroy evidence of their crimes as the war turned against them. There's a reason they burned documents, demolished concentration camps, and murdered witnesses. They understood that accountability requires documentation, and they desperately wanted to avoid accountability. They failed. We know what they did. We know the names of many of their victims. We know the details of their crimes, and we know these things because people refuse to let these stories die. It's important to understand that what I've described wasn't unique to Belarus. Throughout occupied Soviet territory, in Ukraine, in Russia, in the Baltic states, women played crucial roles in resistance movements. And throughout occupied Soviet territory, captured women resistors faced torture, sexual violence, and execution. The specific cases I've focused on are documented because they were particularly well recorded, because photographs survived, because witnesses testified after liberation. But for every named woman in these stories, there are dozens whose names we don't know. Women who died in interrogation chambers without anyone recording their names. Women who were executed in forests and buried in unmarked graves. Women whose resistance activities succeeded precisely because they remained anonymous. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Estimates of civilian deaths in Belarus during the occupation range from 1.6 to 2.3 million people out of a pre-war population of about 9 million. That's between 1/6 and 1/4 of the entire population. Entire villages were destroyed, the inhabitants murdered, the buildings burned, the land left empty. And throughout this systematic destruction, resistance continued. Women continued to run underground networks, to hide Jews and Soviet POWs, to sabotage German supply lines, to gather intelligence, to fight in the forests. The partisan movement in Belarus became one of the most effective resistance movements in any occupied territory during World War II. By 1944, partisans controlled significant swaths of territory behind German lines. They had their own administrative structures, their own supply networks, even their own air bases where Soviet planes could land. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because tens of thousands of people, many of them women, made the choice to resist even knowing what the consequences would be if they were caught. After liberation, Soviet authorities worked to document what had happened during occupation. They collected testimony from survivors. They exhumed mass graves. They catalogued atrocities. They identified, where possible, the victims whose names had been lost. This process was imperfect. The Soviet Union had its own political agenda, its own narrative it wanted to tell about the war. Some stories were emphasized while others were downplayed. The role of Jewish victims, in particular, was often subsumed into the broader category of Soviet citizens, without acknowledgement of the specific genocidal targeting of Jews. But despite these limitations, the documentation effort preserved crucial evidence. It identified many of the women I've told you about today. It recorded testimony that would otherwise have been lost. It created an archive that historians can still access and study. In the decades since, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been efforts to fill in gaps in the historical record. Researchers have worked to identify people in photographs who were previously listed as unknown. They've collected oral histories from surviving witnesses. They've cross-referenced German records with Soviet documents to piece together more complete pictures of what happened. Masha Bruskina, for instance, the 17-year-old hanged in Minsk, wasn't positively identified until years after the war ended. For a long time, she was simply the unknown girl in the photograph. But eventually, through painstaking research and testimony from those who had known her, her identity was established. Her name was restored to her. That matters. Names matter. Remembering specific people, specific acts of courage, specific sacrifices. That matters. Because when we talk about millions of victims, the number becomes almost abstract. The human mind struggles to comprehend suffering at that scale. But when we talk about Masha, 17 years old, who saved 40 people and was hanged with her back turned to her executioners, that becomes real. That becomes a person we can understand and mourn. Every name recovered is an act of resurrection, of sorts. It takes someone from the anonymous mass of victims and restores their individuality, their personhood, their story. So what do we do with these stories? How do we honor these women and what they endured? First, we remember. We tell their stories. We refuse to let their names and their sacrifices fade into historical footnote status. We push back against any attempt to minimize or deny what happened. And yes, there are people who deny or minimize these events. There are those who want to rehabilitate the image of Nazi Germany or its collaborators. There are those who downplay the scale of atrocities or suggest that victims somehow deserved their fate. These impulses must be confronted and rejected. Second, we recognize the warning signs of authoritarianism and systematic dehumanization. The Holocaust and Nazi atrocities didn't begin with death camps. They began with rhetoric. They began with laws that defined certain groups as lesser. They began with propaganda that portrayed enemies as subhuman. They began with the erosion of democratic norms and the concentration of power. By the time mass executions were happening in occupied territories, a long series of steps had already been taken. Steps that people at the time could have recognized and resisted if they had understood where they were leading. We have the benefit of hindsight. We know where that path leads. We have a responsibility to recognize when we see similar patterns emerging in our own time and to speak out against them. Third, we acknowledge that resistance is possible even under the most oppressive conditions. These women and girls lived under military occupation by one of the most brutal regimes in human history. They had no freedoms, no legal protections, no democratic institutions to appeal to. They knew that capture meant torture and death, and they resisted anyway. When we feel powerless in the face of injustice, when we feel like individual action can't possibly make a difference, we should remember that. We should remember Nadia Bogdanova derailing a train at 9 years old. We should remember the doctors of Mogilev continuing their work even after their colleagues were executed. We should remember Lydia Domesh protecting her comrades even as her spine was being broken. We have far more freedom and far more tools for resistance than they did. If they could resist under those circumstances, we have no excuse for passivity in the face of injustice in our own time. Fourth, we must insist on documentation and accountability. One reason we know so much about these specific cases is that people insisted on documenting what happened. They took photographs at great personal risk. They kept records. They testified after liberation. They refused to let these crimes be hidden. When we see human rights abuses today, wherever they occur, whoever is committing them, we must insist on the same level of documentation and accountability. We must support journalists, human rights organizations, and investigators who work to document atrocities. We must ensure that evidence is preserved and that those responsible face consequences. And, finally, we must never accept the dehumanization of any group of people. The horrors I've described were possible because the Nazi ideology taught that certain groups of people were subhuman, that they could be disposed of without moral consequence. Once you accept the premise that some people are less than human, any atrocity becomes justifiable. We see echoes of this kind of rhetoric in our own time, language that portrays immigrants as invaders, that characterizes political opponents as enemies who must be destroyed, that suggests certain religious or ethnic groups are inherently threatening. We must reject this language and this thinking wherever we encounter it. Every person has inherent human dignity. Every person deserves to be treated with basic decency. There are no exceptions to this principle. Let me bring this back to where we started, to those women and girls in occupied Belarus who made the choice to resist. They didn't have to do it. No one would have blamed them for keeping their heads down, for trying to survive in whatever way they could. Survival under occupation is not cowardice. It's often its own form of courage, but they chose active resistance. They chose to fight back, to save others, to maintain their human dignity in the face of a system designed to destroy it. Masha Bruskina chose to help wounded soldiers even knowing the risks. She was 17. She had her whole life ahead of her. She chose to risk it all to save 40 people. The Domesh sisters chose to fight. Olga in the forests, Lydia moving through occupied territory, gathering intelligence. Lydia died protecting her comrades. She never spoke a single name. Nadia Bogdanova survived an execution at 9 years old and chose to go back and fight. She derailed trains, she planted bombs, and when they tortured her, she told them nothing. Dr. Alexandra Pershina and her colleagues in Mogilev chose to use their medical skills to save enemy soldiers and support partisans. They continued even after the first wave of arrests, even knowing exactly what fate awaited them if they were caught. Anastasia Raduk watched them stage her children's executions 4 times and still refused to betray her comrades. These women did not submit. They did not break. They maintained their humanity and their dignity right up to the end. They paid a terrible price for that choice. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. The partisan movement they contributed to helped drive the occupiers out. The people they saved went on to live full lives, to have children and grandchildren. The information they gathered helped Soviet forces plan operations. The supplies they smuggled saved lives. And, perhaps most importantly, their example inspired others. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, reminded people that the occupiers were not all-powerful, that submission was not inevitable, that human dignity could not be destroyed by force. In our own time, when we face injustice or oppression, when we wonder whether